A note of warning. This podcast explores graphic and disturbing stories and includes strong language. It therefore may not be suitable for our young listeners or other folks who may find it disturbing.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Daily, the podcast, bringing you high-profile and under-the-radar cases from across the country every week. I'm Owen Michael. With me today is Emmy Award-winning journalist and television host Anna Garcia. Welcome, Anna.
Well, thank you, Owen. It's great to be here.
It's nice to see you. What have you been up to lately?
Oh, all sorts of fun things.
What do you like to tell us about?
Yeah, I just sold a crime concept to a Canadian production company that I'm pretty excited about. But, of course, I cannot talk about the details of such deal. But
It's the way the business goes.
It is. The way the crime business goes.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
People can find you in various ways on digital and TV and all sorts of stuff, and we'll have some contact information towards the end of the show for that.
At Anna G News. At Anna G News.
Boom.
Anna with one N.
There you go. And it's Anna with one N. This is crucial.
Very important.
A common misconception. We're joined on the phone by Johnny Dwyer, a writer, reporter, and teacher, author of the books American Warlord and his latest book, The Districts, Stories of American Justice from the Federal Courts. Welcome, Johnny Dwyer.
Thanks for having me.
You're joining us from Brooklyn, New York. Is that right?
Yes, from cold Brooklyn.
Is it snowing?
It was snowing when I was driving home, but it's not sticking, thank God.
Do you have a car in Brooklyn?
We are breaking some news here. There are car owners in Brooklyn.
I do.
He's exposing himself.
Yeah.
I love it. So anti-Brooklyn.
A source of much stress in my life. But
we got 2 or 3 days of rain this week, and it's basically locked up the city for the winter conditions here ahead of winter. So we sympathize with the weather over there. We're going to chat about your books and what you're working on, et cetera, at the end of this episode. We're going to jump right into some stories. First of all, for our cases this week, we've got a Chicago woman charged after allegedly shooting a 14-year-old girl after the girl allegedly robbed her with a BB gun on the street. A South Carolina man is sentenced to prison this week for killing his mother's boyfriend, dismembering him, and hiding the body parts underneath her house. But first, a woman's live-in boyfriend shoots her kids dead after an argument about smoking in the house, the same house where there was an earlier tragedy years ago. So this is about Paul Ferguson, a fellow in Connecticut, who was living with his girlfriend.
He had just moved in. They had been in a long-term relationship, but he had just moved in with her and her kids.
Exactly. This is Paul Ferguson. He's 42 years old. He moved in with a woman named Danielle Jett, and she has 2 kids, Della Jett, 15 years old, and Sterling Jett Jr., 16. Jetty, okay.
Jetty.
Thank you.
Welcome.
There's an E on the end there. This happened 9:45 p.m. this Tuesday this week. This is Watertown, Connecticut, about an hour north of New Haven, kind of in the neck of the woods over there in the northeast near Johnny. Danielle Jetty, the teen's mother, told police that her daughter was mad about Paul Ferguson smoking cigarettes in the house. Danielle and Paul had been in a relationship for about 2 years, as you alluded. Police said that Paul had just moved into the house about 2 weeks ago. Danielle told police her 15-year-old daughter, Della, had just returned from a field trip and was talking about Ferguson's smoking in the house. WTIC-TV reports that Paul Ferguson was downstairs in the basement. He was watching TV with the 16-year-old teen. Fairly domestic situation here. Ferguson heard the mom and the daughter upstairs arguing, came upstairs and basically kind of reprimanded the teen daughter and said, don't talk to your mom that way, and, calm down, quiet down. An argument ensued. They kind of got loud. Sterling Jr., the 16-year-old brother, came upstairs. He tried to intercede. That's when police say Ferguson went to the master bedroom and got a Glock pistol from a gun safe. He shot Sterling Jr., the 16-year-old, in the leg. That's when Mom said she ran and got the phone.
She said she had to go downstairs. She told the police to look for a phone to call 911.
Exactly.
And this is when I think it gets a little fuzzy for me as an investigative crime reporter.
Mm-hmm.
Then she says she heard a gunshot. Presumably that would have been when he shot the daughter.
Police found the daughter later. She had been shot in the chest on the back deck of the house.
Right. But according to her, he wasn't quite done because then he went, supposedly, and shot the teen's son again, this time killing him.
In the chest, exactly.
So now you've got both teenagers shot in the chest. And then he's not done yet, according to her.
Right. Then Ferguson reportedly went back into the master bedroom and he shot himself in the head, according to police. Both teens, the mom apparently tried to do CPR on the daughter. The son was already wounded. The teens were hospitalized, but they were pronounced dead there. So already we've got sort of a domestic violence type of thing. Johnny, your stuff has covered a little bit more of the federal situation in this latest book, but you're still dealing with the justice system. I'm sure you've seen or read about plenty of these cases.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a breathtaking tragedy. I actually spoke with the Watertown PD this afternoon just to try and get a sense whether the story had moved forward. And the big question mark for me was this gun. The perpetrator, he's a felon. He shouldn't be in possession of a weapon.
Right.
Watertown's just 35 minutes up the road from Newtown, where the Sandy Hook tragedy occurred in 2012. And it would seem that there's a sort of connection there, just in terms of the fact that this gun was present in the house. There were other weapons present in the house. And if anything we've learned about guns in general, is that the mere presence of them increases the likelihood of murder or suicide. And this house has seen 4 deaths, 2 suicides, and 2 homicides. And it's, that's a statistical blip within Connecticut, but it's really significant. In terms of how we understand this sort of violence. Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of stuff here that seems like there should have been warning signs throughout here. So for a little bit background there, Paul Ferguson was a convicted felon. He was not legally permitted to have access to a gun, as you said. He was previously convicted of unlawful restraint charges. He had been arrested on a sexual assault charge in 2007. He was also convicted in a 2014 theft case. He'd been sentenced to 18 months in prison, according to the Hartford Courant newspaper. The police said that there were other guns locked in the house in a safe. Police did say, though, that Ferguson retrieved this Glock that she didn't know about from a safe. It's unclear if there was more than one safe. Johnny, did you get any indication from your phone call today on any of those details?
No, they basically said the 2 things I asked for was the gun. That's under investigation as to who it belonged to, how it was obtained. And then I asked about drugs and alcohol. A lot of time these situations are aggravated by someone using either. And, they're doing an autopsy and they're just not commenting on that at this point.
Yeah, it's still fresh. This was Tuesday night, essentially.
And the background is that back in October of 2016, the children's father committed suicide in that house. So you have a very long history of tragedy in that house.
This poor woman is, she lost her
whole family.
Her husband 2 years ago, in 2016. Now the boyfriend and the 2 kids, which is unbelievably tragic. You can't even imagine. The sibling's father had killed himself in the same house with a self-inflicted gunshot wound after a minor domestic dispute, as police described it. That's a really unfortunate series of events, and I wonder, we have very strong opinions on gun control and gun ownership and gun access and all that kind of thing. People have strong opinions on this one way or the other. Several guns in the house after you've had a significant incident like this.
Where you had your husband kill himself with a gun. You may not want to have guns in the house given that kind of history. I don't know. There's a lot about this case. It's a horrible tragedy, and it's overwhelming, the human loss here. And these 2 teenagers who were so regarded and loved by their friends, and the community is mourning. But I got to tell you, there's just, I want to know more. I really do want to know more. This crime scene, even if it ends up being one of these murder-suicide cases, there's got to be a lot more information about where everyone was. There's a lot we don't know. There's a lot that we don't know, and there's only, sadly, one person who has survived, and she's so traumatized to tell us what went down in that house.
Indeed. And I don't know what the statistics are offhand, but once gun violence has occurred in a household, whether that increases things or decreases the chances of something happening in the future, Johnny, as you alluded, just the fact of having a gun in the house increases exponentially the chance. Obviously, if there's no gun there, nobody's going to shoot anybody. If you have a gun in the house, the increases chances that it's going to be used. And this particular series of events, I mean, that's just a tragic coincidence. And, coincidences are an awful thing to have in a tragedy like this.
Mm.
And it's interesting because part of the marketing of weapons in our society is that they're useful for protecting ourselves. Whether it's from a home invasion threat or whether it's from the government being an overpowering presence in our society. But there's a Supreme Court ruling recently in November that is actually going to force Remington Arms to address their marketing of the Bushmaster rifle.
This would be the
as to whether
AR-15.
Exactly, and this was the weapon that was used in Sandy Hook, or one of the weapons that was used.
Right, Adam Lanza.
And just what we think about the Second Amendment, it just shows that the conversation is shifting slightly as to how we well regulate these weapons. And I think if we understand just the raw numbers of, a gun plus people plus anger equals these outcomes, then, we as parents, if we can step away from the situation, can just make a decision. What's the cost benefit of having a weapon in the house? And I feel like, in situations like this, and I've covered a lot of breaking news crime, you really want to come away with some sort of meaning from it. And
that can be frustrating.
I only hope, it's extremely frustrating. And it seems like the community is now trying to raise money to honor these kids with an appropriate service, and they're having a vigil tomorrow night. But I think there's an urge to do more and to sort of change the sort of structural situation that leads to these incidents.
Whenever we cover this stuff a lot, we inevitably have lots of people with very strong opinions on both sides of the issue, but especially we'll have a lot of commenters talking about these issues, that it's not necessarily the gun's fault, or that it's not that if you hadn't been there or whatever. The details are still coming out on this, so we will, of course, keep you updated on truecrimedaily.com as we have it. But this is I can't believe that all this stuff happened to this poor in this house, to this family, the whole thing. It's tragic. We'll have more as we know it. Moving on to a South Carolina story that we have. This is Charles Bridges in South Carolina. It's a 20-year-old kid, 20-year-old man, I should say. He pleaded guilty to murder on Tuesday, just before his trial began this week. He was accused of killing his mother's boyfriend, a man named Gary Stone, who was 51 years old. His mother's name is Dawn Wilkins. She's 45 years old now. This is occurring in the area of Gaffney, South Carolina, about 50 miles southwest of Charlotte, North Carolina. So it's kind of northern South Carolina. Charlotte Observer newspaper reports that on November 3rd, 2017, Cherokee County Sheriff's deputies responded to a report of a domestic incident at a mobile home where Dawn Wilkins lived with her boyfriend, Gary Stone. They were reportedly living together in a common law marriage relationship. Stone told deputies that he and the son, his name is Charles Bridges, they had an argument, but the son had walked away to cool off and was not present when deputies were there. They left. Authorities say Charles Bridges, who was 18 at the time, he returned after deputies left, and he killed him. Sheriff said Bridges choked the victim out and later stabbed the victim. Police say Bridges' mother, Dawn Wilkins, then helped Bridges cut up Stone's body with several weapons, according to police, according to the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office. They then put the body parts in different containers, which they stowed underneath the mobile home. That's very graphic. Deputies investigating the disturbance Stone's disappearance found his remains at the residence about 2 weeks after the murder. WYFF TV reports authorities got a tip from someone who believed a murder took place at the residence, and they said they gave specific details Charles Bridges was sentenced to 35 years in prison this week. Dawn Wilkins herself, the mother, has a criminal record with charges including burglary, fraud, assault and battery, criminal sexual conduct with a minor, among others. She's already pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact, desecration of body, conspiracy to kidnap. Before her son's trial, she's incarcerated while she awaits her sentencing. Another one of those domestic violence issues, this one in particular, this is an 18-year-old kid. It seems that there was some, not to speculate too much into it, but was protective of his mother.
He felt that his mother was being mistreated and she needed some kind of protection. It sounds like she stood up for her, and in that moment, I don't know whether his intention was to kill her boyfriend. Like you said, he first choked him and then he stabbed him. She was never charged with murder.
Right.
She did not kill him, but she certainly helped her son cut up the boyfriend and put him under the trailer.
So I'm sure all three of us have sort of addressed or covered stories like this where, it makes sense to somebody at the time to dismember this person, but then to stow the evidence under whether that's a crime of opportunity, whether, they were sure somebody was going to come looking for him right off the bat. It seems, it's a wooded kind of a rural area. It seems like maybe it would have been better to
bury him,
put the body out in the woods or something. Of course, that's, I don't recommend anybody does that whatsoever. But the fact that someone called police or called the sheriff's office and gave specific details, that also leads me to believe that maybe
somebody talked about
it. I don't have a picture of it offhand, but it's a mobile home and it's kind of on a hill and it's in a wooded area. You're not sure. It looks a little bit remote. So, there's another one of those things that people talk. Even in bad situations like that.
And also, I believe that the victim, he had been missing for some time, so he was also reported missing because I think the cops had been there. First time they not the first time for the altercation, but the first time they went looking for him. When they came back, they had the search warrant, and that is why they were able to use the evidence, and it was obtained quite legally with a search warrant. I think the sheriff also made some comments to the media about how evil this whole thing was and how disturbing it was to his deputies to have to go through the containers and the body parts, which is interesting. We are, of course, talking about a man's life here, but there's that and this is the kind of thing that crime reporters always get into when you start to get to know the law enforcement people a little bit better and you have that relationship, which kind of brings us back to Johnny and his entree into the federal courts, is you start to get to know the people who work these cases, and it does affect them. It is a horrible thing for someone to see that, and you presumably get into law enforcement because you want to protect people. You never want this to be the ending, the loss of life. And it feels like such a disregard for life. You could say, well, killing someone is certainly a disregard for life, but then it's what you do with them afterwards that just continues this disgusting, revolting, violent action.
There's the heat of the moment situation here, but then, you're choking somebody out here, according to the sheriff, and now this man is incapacitated because he's ostensibly unconscious.
So you don't have to kill him.
You don't have to kill him at this point. We're not there, obviously, but that speaks to some anger. And then there's also, is there anything more? I mean, there's plenty of awful things, but it's horrifying to think of actually physically dismembering a person, like a human body. That takes,
It's a new level, which is very interesting. Like, how do you go from, let's say he chokes him out and it's an accident. Okay, you still have a moment, you take a beat, you don't have to kill the guy. Now you kill the guy, which somehow, and this is the amazing thing, is that criminals, I always would say to people, especially like during divorces, where ultimately like the husband or the wife either kills or gets a contract for the other person, and all because they didn't want the shame of divorce. For the life of me, I do not understand that logic. Like, why is it easier just to kill the person? Whoever thinks this?
Well, and it's one of the most common situations too, right?
Always. Johnny, you must have seen that even in federal court. You're like, and this was your response to the problem, was to make it so much worse by committing a crime?
Yeah, the logic kind of collapses. I mean, I think the interesting thing is that that moment when the victim dies in a murder, the power kind of shifts where all of a sudden the body takes on this power over the perpetrator. They have to do something with it. And this is, Edgar Allan Poe wrote about this in Telltale Heart, but it's like, what do we do with this body? And I write a little bit in my book about these two mobsters trying to deal with the body, and it became a decades-long struggle for them. And, of course, it ended with the FBI finding enough of the body to make a case. But this notion that, in 1 minute you can have control over someone's life or death, the next moment they're literally a liability for you, and they're the greatest threat to your liberty. It's a really interesting thing. This case, obviously horrific and sad. I mean, from what I read, there's that the mother and son both acknowledge using meth. I think that would color your judgment, and perhaps make this really tough manual labor of dismembering a body.
Yeah, that's certainly a common theme when you hear about meth fueled crimes and things like that. There's a certain amount of dissociation. I still, it's, cutting off an arm or cutting, however you're doing it, after you do the first one, I guess it's speculation. You sort of have to go in some sort of fugue state or something like that. You don't really think about what you're doing, because physically hacking somebody up like this, I mean, that's a lot of work. A human body is there's a lot of square footage there when you're trying to do it. So obviously I'm not a criminal, or at least I'm not a criminal at this level.
Let's hope not, Owen.
I speed a little bit once in a while on the roadway, but my first thought would not be to dispose of it this way. I mean, like I said, I would. Johnny, you bring up a good point. You've got this literally this sort of dead weight on your conscience and the physical evidence here. You want to get this away as far away from you as possible and get it. That seems to me. But you bring up a good point when we're talking about drugs, especially when we're talking about crystal methamphetamine. We're on. It's there's no shortage of stories out there of people doing some pretty bizarre actions and decisions.
Not when you make your best decisions.
Yeah. And, on the body issue, it's kind of interesting because The Irishman, I'm not sure if you guys have had a chance to see it.
Oh, I love it. I've seen it twice. I'm obsessed with it.
We will. I'm sure we'll have some comments about this as well. Go ahead. Yes, we both seen it.
No, I feel the same way about it. And, the absence of Jimmy Hoffa's body is really what empowered his myth. Because, if you think if they had discovered his body, a lot of people were getting whacked at that point. And he was a big deal, a massive figure in the labor movement, but his mystery made him into an uber celebrity. And,
it's almost an urban myth.
Yeah. And I think that's this notion of the power of a body it can take on after life, as a liability, as a myth maker. I mean, disappearing a human being is it's a crime under the Geneva Convention. It's a crime against humanity, because this notion of the body as not only something we have a sentimental attachment to, but as evidence of a crime is so significant.
I was a bartender many years ago, and I had a defense lawyer who was a regular customer of mine, and he always would share some stories, and he had his theory of the best way to dispose of a body, and he used to sort of hint around it all the time. For legal reasons, he would not come out and say it, but he basically kind of outlined it. But yeah, it's about getting rid of any identifying physical characteristics, all the rest. To speak to the Irishman as well, there's some speculation that he may have made this entire thing up. There's, you can't trust mobsters, and mobsters are saying he made this up or he had nothing to do with this. He was an errand guy, and who are you going to believe? Was he simply? I don't want to give any spoilers away to anybody who hasn't seen the movie, but. This to me almost sort of adds to the urban myth too. Like, do I care to believe it? It makes sense. It's the shortest distance between two lines.
It does make a lot of sense. For me, it was very personal because I was a reporter in Atlantic City, and Angelo Bruno and his family, which this is about.
This is a Harvey Keitel character, right?
He was the mob boss in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia mob always controlled Atlantic City, and New Jersey was split in half. You had the Philly mob covered half of Jersey, and you had the New York mob covered northern Jersey. And I covered a lot of mob trials. It would be the next generation of Angelo Bruno's family. And the restaurant, I have eaten at that restaurant. It is a real place. It is a real mobster place. I cannot tell you how connected I felt to this film because of all the organized crime that I covered in Philadelphia and New York. Not Philadelphia and New York, Philadelphia and Atlantic City. And one of my favorite stories, I've just got to tell you this story because I covered so many mob trials, is so there was this one street in Atlantic City, and this is where Nicky Scarfo, he was the leader of the Atlantic City mob. He had his residence there. It was the safest street in Atlantic City. It also had a restaurant, but I'm telling you, it was the safest place ever. And I used to love to eat there because it was so safe as a woman. Okay, so it's his trial. He gets convicted. And I'm in one of those big news vans that you can't stand, right? And I go out to tape whatever it is I'm going to tape. And I come back to the news van. And in the windshield is this note. And it is written, back then you'd buy the whole carton of cigarettes, right? You'd buy a whole carton. This person had ripped the carton and taken one of the long sides of it and written the note on the back of this carton. And he left it for me, and he said, "Little Nicky didn't get a fare, but he wrote trail instead of trial." Not a good speller, okay, but it's all right. It's television, and I'll never forget that. It was such a message that was so direct to the reporter on the story.
That's a good thing.
Message sent and received, and then I had to report on it.
Well, you seek out relationships as a reporter, and lots of different things. But you sometimes your sources are unsavory characters, but they're still giving you good information. And if you've got that relationship, they're still people.
Oh, totally. I think one of the craziest stories I ever did was on a mob hitman who was in hiding. And he was a hitman. Little Nicky, Nicky Crow was his name. Nicholas Caramondi was his name. Little Nicky Crow is what they called him. And I remember interviewing him in hiding, and I was so perplexed because he was so charming. It was like watching The Irishman or any of those mob movies, Goodfellas. He was funny and charming and well-spoken, and he said something to me that has stayed with me my whole life when I said to him, well, I'm perplexed here because, I like talking with you, but you've killed all these people and
you're a psychopath.
Right. Yeah. And I can't separate this. And I said, I don't understand how you could do all this. And he said to me, it wasn't me. It was the wall around me. I have never forgotten that. And I always think about that because I'm torn. I think good people do bad things, and I think bad people do good things. And I don't know, Johnny, if you find that as a reporter.
Yeah, you've covered a significant section of mafia-related stories, Johnny, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean that's a section of the book is it's about one trial in particular, but also just about how we've developed our prosecutorial culture around organized crime, which was, that was the most elite unit within the U.S. Attorney's offices here for years. But yeah, I mean, in terms of this disassociation with violence, I think a larger sort of moral order takes over when you're involved either in an organized crime family or in a political regime that operates like one, which is very much what happened in my first book, where, there's the work of being an associate or the work of, being part of a death squad.
You're kind of a soldier.
And,
and you're taking the top-down orders.
And that's all the justification you need, because on the other side of it, you'll get killed if you don't, one way or the other.
In for a penny, in for a pound, as they say. Exactly. Yes. Well, so the irony is not lost on us that we're talking about rural South Carolina here and comparing it to major organized crime metropolitan hits. evil is evil, and
Yep.
killing is killing, and this is it's one of the oldest stories in the book, of course, in the literal book. Let's talk about Araceli Diaz in Chicago. This is a woman who was robbed at BB gunpoint, and she basically turned the situation around and shot her assailant. This is Araceli Diaz is 21 years old. She reportedly made an arrangement on Facebook to sell a Siberian Husky dog in Chicago last week. Diaz apparently sells, she breeds.
She's a breeder.
She breeds Huskies, and it's a side business, or because she has a full-time job as another thing, as her attorney says. We'll get into that as a second here. She met 2 teen girls Friday on the southwest side around 6 p.m. to sell this dog.
They agreed to meet on Facebook. That's
Exactly.
how the introduction was made.
How many people do things these days?
Yeah, you sell
on
a
the
lot of stuff on
marketplace.
Facebook.
Exactly. She met these 2 teen girls on the southwest side around 6 p.m. Chicago Sun-Times newspaper reports that Diaz wanted $800 for the dog. So this is a substantial transaction. You're carrying around that's serious cash. I'm sure, you're meeting strangers, and I'm sure there's all sorts of people have opinions on how they want to do that and meet in public place, and et cetera and so forth.
It's not weird that they would meet in a park?
From the description that I could see, this looked like this was just a street corner, and it was probably near one of these people's houses. It's not near her house because she was about 9 miles away. It's unclear why she was in this neighborhood itself, but it's a very residential area, and I did a kind of a Google Street View, and I kind of ran around the neighborhood there, and I didn't see any particular thing, so they must have agreed that this is the address to meet at. It's unclear. I shouldn't speculate too much. One of the girls, a 14-year-old, reportedly pulled out a BB gun and attempted to rob Diaz. The circumstances are unclear, but it appears the other girl took off with the dog. The 14-year-old pulled out an unknown metal object. Police later found found a broken BB gun at the scene. That's what they ascribed the weapon to be. She told Diaz to get on the ground, and then she allegedly struck her twice in the head and in the face. Police say that's when Araceli Diaz pulled out her own Glock 9mm pistol and shot the 14-year-old in the chest and the abdomen, and then drove away. The teen was hospitalized in critical condition, was later arrested and charged with a felony count of attempted robbery with a firearm. She's due to be in juvenile court next week. I suppose it's a good thing. A 9mm Glock at close range is not messing around. Hitting in the chest and in the abdomen could have easily killed this young lady. So
and the way they found the lady selling the dog, right? The lady who's the dog breeder. So she got into her caddy and she drove off, and with the help of surveillance cameras, they were able to figure out who she was. And police say that when they got to the house, the car was there in the driveway, and the Glock was just on the passenger's seat.
It was loaded with 8 rounds. Which I don't know what city, but especially in Chicago, you may or may not have heard some of the stories over the last several years about gun violence in Chicago and sort of what's going on, gang violence and various shootings and murder. And there's a lot going on in Chicago, but I wouldn't leave my gun in the passenger seat of a car, no matter what, in any city. It seems like a bad form, bad gun ownership. This woman, Araceli Diaz, she did admit to the shooting. She has no prior criminal record. She was arrested that night. She has a firearm owner's identification card issued by Illinois State Police. That's basically your gun license. But she was not issued a concealed carry license, which is what she was doing here.
Right.
Is essentially you're not supposed to be carrying this
So
around.
they didn't get her for shooting the 14-year-old. The cops charged her on a gun violation.
Right.
And right now the authorities believe her version of the story, that she went there to sell the dog, but she feels that it was a setup because the girl took the dog and not only wouldn't give the dog back, but also wouldn't give her the $800 and then hit her in the head and assaulted her.
Right.
So,
and BB guns and pellet guns, it's been described a couple of different ways, but they can be very lifelike. And at 5 or 6, after 6 in Chicago right now, it's dark. Somebody's waving around one of these things and sort of hits you with a thing like this. You may well believe that you are under attack by a fatal weapon here. So sure enough, shooting back. So yeah, prosecutors even agree that this was self-defense. There was one story that I read about this that the police didn't even want to charge her at all because this
on
is
the
sort
gun
of,
violation.
not anything. But it was fairly minor. She had a $5,000 bail, and I believe she's been released since then. The dog, according to her attorney, is died also, though.
The dog is dead.
We don't understand. It's unclear how that happened.
Right.
Whether the dog, who knows?
We don't know.
Whether it got run over, or whether they killed the dog or got injured in a shooting, who knows what. But that's unfortunate that we do have a death here, and it's a dog nobody likes. A dog dies.
It's terrible.
A Siberian Husky, notwithstanding. A very vocal dog. So yeah,
it's a weird case.
It's a strange case, but it's almost good news in a Chicago sense, in that this is a shooting that did not end in death, and this is a person. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of commenters. This is self-defense. This is exactly what you want to have a gun for, especially in an urban environment like this, where you may be in a rough neighborhood, et cetera. And there may be, I'm sure, Johnny, you may have opinions on this yourself as far as the concealed carry state to state and circumstances and that kind of thing. Chicago itself is notorious for having pretty tight gun control laws there, Illinois, I should say. But of course, Wisconsin and Indiana and Missouri and surrounding states, much looser. And they basically tracked how these guns get into here, resulting in kind of a really tight gun situation in the city.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something oddly sweet about this story, the fact that it was over a husky rather than, a kilo of heroin.
Right, a cash or drug deal or something, right.
Yeah, but, it's interesting because Chicago has this terrible reputation for gun violence, but the numbers have actually sort of drifted downward in recent years. And like this year, they're at 1,600 as of this month, whereas last year during the same period, it was about 1,800 shootings. It's not really much of a silver lining, but it's something. And I know in this community, in Little Village in particular, there's been a lot of pressure on the Chicago Police Department because they've seen an uptick locally in shootings. There was a 32-year-old man who was killed walking home from his job earlier this month. A 7-year-old girl was shot on Halloween, and they arrested a 15-year-old boy. But I think the trend in Chicago over the last decade has been young shooters and innocent victims, and it's terrible. It's really terrible.
It is.
I wouldn't
go ahead.
I wouldn't blame someone going into the city to try and protect himself with a weapon. I think especially if you're a licensed carrier and you're trained in how to use a gun, it makes sense, particularly if you can just look at the map and see, you're going to a neighborhood where there's gun violence. You should be prepared for it.
And Little Village, I believe this woman lives in Cicero, which is sort of west side. It can be rough around the edges itself.
Yes.
But this Little Village area is also sort of on the south side, and it's been making quite a few headlines. And we should also say that, they attributed some of this stuff to gang violence, but it's not in the sense of like LA with the Bloods and the Crips or the whatever. This is sort of like a scattered, decentralized, lots of little turf wars and little young kids and things like that. In other words, it's almost the lack of structure that's keeping, when you have established tribal gangs sort of regulating the things, it almost, Johnny, maybe you can speak a little bit to this. It almost, speaking of the top down orders and things like this.
Yeah, I mean,
if you got two powerful gangs running a thing and they're going at each other, that's different than a bunch of small little skirmishes. Everybody sort of going block to block and nobody has control. Not making the case for
organized crime.
Yeah, exactly. But there is something to be said for, or again, we're talking about organized crime. When there's organized crime, you feel safe in a particular neighborhood or a particular restaurant or whatever, because this is the safe zone when it comes to that. But you've got situations in Chicago where there is no safe zone because nobody's sort of in control of these different neighborhoods.
Well, I just don't understand that. I think, for those of us not from Chicago, all we know is there's been terrible gun violence there over the last few years. And for the life of me,
really,
no one has been able to explain to me why it is so hard to make that city safer. I mean, what is it going to take? and maybe the two of you have some insight into that for those of us. And I realize the answers are always far more complicated, but if this were happening in Manhattan, for example, or in Brooklyn,
even in LA,
it would not be going on for this long, right?
When Bratton came in and did the CompStat, which he also did in New York, of course, they got scientific about it and they went after it. But Chicago, and Johnny, I'm sure you actually are better informed on this from your coverage than myself, but they're dealing with no shortage of sort of city corruption, and the Chicago police force has been under fire for various calls that the higher ups are making. Even the last mayor, Rahm Emanuel, and the Laquan McDonald situation, there was
exactly.
So that kind of chaos, I think, doesn't really breed a lot of confidence in organizing.
And wait a minute, isn't Charlie Beck there now? Isn't he the new commissioner? He's the former police chief of Los Angeles who had gone into retirement. So
acting police chief. Commissioner, I think.
I think that's what they call him. Yeah, commissioner is.
Because also the other guy, Eddie Johnson, just got fired by Mayor Lightfoot last week or this week. Actually, this
I think
week,
it was on Monday.
Yeah. So, there's all that chaos. Go ahead.
One thing you alluded to, which I think is really important, is, these major street gangs on the South Side, like the Blackstone Rangers, the El Rukins.
Mm-hmm. El Rukin. I remember that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they disappeared, and what sort of grew in their place were these atomized, hyper local gangs that are really fueled by a lot of social media beefs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's driven a lot of the violence. And I think part of the problem of the Chicago Police Department wrapping its head around it is that they don't have any reference point. A lot of these cops came of age during this era when there were these huge dominant street gangs. And then all of a sudden they're looking at a map that not only does it not make sense, it's constantly changing in real time. And add on top of it the lack of credibility of Chicago Police Department and the African American community, which, I know Lori Lightfoot, her election was kind of seen as one potential remedy to that. She was investigating the Chicago Police Department prior to being elected. So, the thing is, again, there is a silver lining there, though. The trend is downward. I mean, it's still, the numbers are way too high. But as someone who lives in New York, I've seen the gun violence drop, and even post stop and frisk.
Right, the stop and frisk stuff, right.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't bumped up significantly. In some communities it has. But I want to be hopeful for Chicago.
The thing that it strikes me is it's sort of like comparing. It's almost like you need a counterinsurgency type of thing that you see in like Afghanistan or something, or where you've got a bunch of small warring factions instead of two major things going at it. Not to belabor the point, but it almost requires sort of that kind of military strategy to address this. However, I'm also
neighborhoods don't like that. Communities don't
exactly.
like those words,
there's
and
also
I can understand that.
The equipment and the attitude, and in some places, going to St. Louis and other places like that, it's that militarization that actually sparks even more backlash and the rest of these. So there's no good way that I know how to do this. They are doing it, like you said. The trend is good. I also, I've seen being interested in this and being from somewhat of the neighborhood, I've also seen outreach and things like that. I feel like there is some of this is that community leaders in the African American community and in some of these neighborhoods, there's a sort of peer pressure that we need to do better, and like the world is watching, and this is Chirac, and young kids coming up and things like that they're trying to they're trying to address this in. You don't want to be on the map like this. Of course, if you're a local kid and the block is the only thing that you know, I don't know. It's complicated. I don't have any good remedies for this. I mean,
I do find the observation of the change in control over these micro areas and the use of social media to incite, argue, pick a fight, or finish something is very interesting and very challenging, and shows you how technology affects crime and how crime is carried out, especially in this way.
And it's funny, I was sitting down with a defense attorney, and it was outside of a gang case, and he just was shaking his head, and he said, social media is just killing these guys. And he wasn't referring to shootings, he was referring to it was killing them at trial, because there would literally be Facebook or Instagram posts of threats back and forth.
Right.
And then, at the end of it, someone would be shot. And, proving intent is a big part of any criminal charge. And if your intent's all over Instagram or Facebook, you're not doing yourself any favors.
Right. But it's that's another realm of boasting and dominance and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
That's it's a sign. It's definitely an indication of. It's sort of a sign of the times of what we live in right now. Social media is not just in space. It's not just an abstract thing. It's having real world consequences, as we well know. Moving to some of our comments this week, we have...
What are the people saying, Owen?
Terrible transition. Let's see. We get comments.
Yes, and what are they saying?
Social media, speaking of which.
Yes.
We have this particular story. This is about a woman who received her food in a drive-thru at McDonald's. Mm-hmm. She allegedly became upset when she was given ketchup instead of jelly. She asked for jelly. Yeah.
Jelly? What was the jelly supposed to go on?
Well, I know.
I'm sorry. I'm getting sidetracked.
McDonald's was my first job, actually. There's a small thing about that, and I cannot tell you what the heck. I never worked in breakfasts, though, so I presume it was probably a breakfast
maybe jelly
thing.
For the breakfast.
Right,
okay.
I guess, but she got ketchup, and so understandably, she was angry, and she exchanged words with the drive-thru person, and she allegedly pulled out a gun. This 20-year-old person, she was arrested. Our Rose B says some people are just too triggered, literally. She needs help with her anger issues before she actually kills someone. This is a good thing. You don't want people popping off with guns. And this is in Memphis, by the way, which is also having some street violence and that kind of thing, not to the level of Chicago, but you don't want to be waving around a gun in polite society.
She should have gone to the Waffle House instead.
Waffle House is delicious.
24 hours a day. Love their grits.
As Win D says, not sure if she'll get ketchup or jelly in prison. Both, I imagine, are treats in prison. And Ryan C says, who asks for jelly with a McDonald's meal? There's your problem right there, Anna. You've got the agreement there.
Hello? Did I not get that?
I think most of our commenters will be on that same page there. So, nobody likes to wait in line. Nobody likes bad service, but don't, just relax.
No, and they're always very nice at McDonald's, and they work really hard. That's what I can't stand, is that level of disrespect for someone who works so freaking hard.
Yeah.
Everyone who works there in any fast food, in any service industry, they're working their butts off.
This is not said enough. Also, it's just rude to pull out a gun on anybody.
Yeah.
Johnny, tell us about the. Let's move on and talk about this book that you have written. You've got two books out. The first one is American Warlord. This one that's out right now is called The Districts: Stories of American Justice from the Federal Courts. Tell us about that book. How you got into this, into writing it, what you did for research, et cetera.
Sure. It's interesting. I started my sort of crime reporting as a victim of crime when I was a young kid. I found myself at the wrong end of a gun in New Orleans, and it was just a standard issue robbery. A friend and we lost maybe like $6 and a 6-pack of Natural Light in the whole exchange.
Just on the street?
Yeah, it's just on the street. And New Orleans, it's a tough town. They deal with a lot of this stuff. But a few hours later, one of the perpetrators was shot by someone he had tried to mug a few blocks away. Wow. And I was brought through the crime scene to identify, some of my personal effects, like my wallet, and eventually the surviving perpetrator. I was brought down to New Orleans for trial, and he pled out basically as soon as I walked in the courtroom because he knew what that would mean.
Really?
But that introduced me to how the criminal justice system operates. And also, some of its inadequacies. And I wrote my first book about a federal case in Miami, which involved war crimes in Liberia. And then as I was reporting that book, I said, I really like spending time in court. And I think Anna can commiserate here, but whether it's covering mob trials or white collar hedge fund trials, or terrorism cases, it's a really fascinating look into the criminal world. And it's a sort of journey that's led on the one hand by prosecutors, federal prosecutors, who are the sort of, they're among the most powerful bureaucrats in the country.
Right.
And then criminal defense attorneys who, are among the most colorful people you could ever interview. And I decided that I wanted to write a book about the court, and I happen to live in probably the most interesting jurisdiction in the country, the Eastern District of New York. But 2 subway stops away is the second most interesting, which is the Southern District of New York.
Has been in the news quite a bit lately, but for crimes unrelated to our topic today. But yes, go on.
The maker of kings.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I mean, Anna's right. The other thing I wanted to write about is just the trajectory of prosecutors in New York, in particular the Southern District, which gave us, obviously gave us Giuliani. But
oh my God, what is going on with that man? Can someone please explain how he's gone off the rails? How you go from like star prosecutor, fighter, right, cleaning up the streets, to like meeting with odd people in Ukraine. I don't understand.
Although really, maybe that's not so
far-fetched.
Not so different.
I think so. He used to be so highly regarded in his high profile in those high profile cases, and now he just looks like a man who's off the rails.
And in the Southern District, we might want to explain some of that too. But that's Giuliani particularly made his bones in mob cases.
Yes,
which is part of what this book, The Districts, addresses, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I write a bit about that. I also write about how Giuliani essentially cribbed those cases from the Eastern District. And I mean, since we were talking about The Irishman earlier, a little bit more Scorsese trivia. If you guys have the chance to watch Goodfellas, there's a great scene. Yeah, I mean, there's a great scene with Ray Liotta, and he's sitting down with the prosecutor, and something struck me about that scene. I'm like, there's something interesting about this prosecutor. He is or was an actual mob prosecutor. And he was the one that Giuliani cribbed a lot of his mob cases from. His name's Ed McDonald.
Interesting.
So if you watch that scene, you'll realize, the reason it seems so real is because this guy's the real thing. But yeah, Giuliani, but it's interesting. He set a template. You start by going after the big crime base, which at that time was the mob. Then you hit the next big crime base, which was white collar. And then he closed out his career on public corruption, which is when you're sort of paving the way for political office. What's the best way to do it? Well, you go after dirty politicians. And that's exactly what he did, and others have emulated that to a certain degree since then, as a way to pave the way, not necessarily to politics. I mean, now the big thing for former prosecutors to do is to jump into media. I know. I know.
Yeah, we've met a few.
Yeah.
There is one thing I know we have to wrap soon, but there are 2 quotes from your book that I find very, very telling. And it's you did this interview with the LA Times, and that you said that you love reading about powerful people before they were powerful, and that's what you wanted to do in this book, because it was such an area of kingmakers, if you will. And I find that fascinating. What is it about the soon-to-be powerful person that you find so fascinating in the details of how they became that way and before they were and had the power?
Well, I mean, one, they'll talk to a lowly reporter like me. I mean,
isn't that the truth, right?
Helps.
You haven't big shot idea yet.
But yeah, they're closer to what it was that made them want to do this work in the first place. And I really, I see in prosecutors a lot of what I see in myself. They're these sort of natural storytellers. They're obviously motivated to tell a very specific story of innocence and guilt. But I met, in particular, I met 2 federal prosecutors who were sort of at the peak of their game in their doing terrorism cases, and they've since jumped. One works directly for William Barr now, the other's at the top of the CIA, and I just caught them at this moment when they were doing just sort of meat and potatoes terrorism cases, and you see how they play the game, as opposed to how they coach the game, and it's really, I mean, it was really amazing to watch.
Do they still
for a
take
few
your call?
years.
I'm curious. Will they still take your call? Are you still in touch with them?
I cannot talk about sources.
I take
I
that
know
as
you can
a
understand
yes.
that.
Oh,
but,
that's interesting. Yeah. Okay.
Nudge, nudge.
Nudge, nudge. That's good. Well, that says something good about whoever it is we may be talking about, that if they still presumably, supposedly take your calls, that maybe there's still a little bit of them within this new powerful person.
The man is a writer as well. And, especially once you get into those upper echelons, I mean, the press is a good thing, whether you're getting it on TV or being written about or whatever else. It's
yes
certainly,
and no, right?
It's,
because trust is the biggest part. And I think for a reporter, I think the reason people ever do sit down with me, I never strong arm anyone. I don't offer anything. I always say to them, check me out. Look at my work.
Sure.
And if you want to talk to me, great. I promise you I'll be fair. I'll ask you some tough questions, but I'll be fair. And my work speaks for itself. And if that's not your style, then I guess we got nothing else to talk about.
Mm.
And I think, I don't know, Johnny, do you feel the same way, that your work speaks for yourself? And that will be the deciding factor on whether someone wants to talk to you.
Yeah, and I mean, that's all you can do. And there was one prosecutor in particular who he introduced me to a bunch of other prosecutors, and there were some intelligence people in the room, and he said, "But don't worry about Johnny. He writes nonfiction," which I thought was hilarious. I mean, I wasn't looking to break stories off of them. I was working on a book, and I think that gave me a little flexibility in terms of access when you're trying to break stories.
Right.
They have ethical obligations to keep things out of the media a lot of times.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's the long game versus the, making tomorrow's headlines or the 6 p.m. headlines or whatever.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So in this book, you've got you're covering organized crime, you're covering drugs, white collar crime, terrorism, public corruption. The name of the book is The District's Stories of American Justice from the Federal Courts by Johnny Dwyer. That's a Knopf book. We will have information in our YouTube descriptions and podcast descriptions about how to order that book. Johnny, is there any information as far as if people want to read more of your stuff or just check out your day-to-day stuff? How do people get a hold of you?
Yeah, so you can hit me up at johnnydwyer.net, or I'm on Twitter at Johnny D. Dwyer. I'm working on the next book about offshore finance and money laundering. So if you're laundering money right now, please reach out.
That we should have a conversation offline with no microphones.
I was going to say, you're just making friends all over the place with stories like this.
Well, sometimes some of your best friends happen to be offshore attorneys.
Well, congratulations on the book, and we look forward to the next book, Johnny. Thanks for joining us this week. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Anna, how about yourself? Where can viewers and listeners find out more about what you're working on, where your socials are, what's happening with you?
It's pretty consistent across Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, at Anna with one N, Anna G News. That's me. Easy to find.
Anna G with one news. That's one N in the A, N-A-G-N-E-W-S.
Anna G News.
Can't go wrong with that. Again, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Johnny. That's our show for this week. Find our content on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play, and on YouTube. And get updates and subscribe to our newsletter at truecrimedaily.com. Until next week, this is True Crime Daily, the podcast reminding you, don't do crimes.
No, it doesn't pay.
Don't do them.
Bye, everyone.